Democratic Services just to talk us through the online procedures, and I apologise that our connection seemed to be really bad today, so I hope we can get through the meeting all right. But Leila, if you can do your bit, please.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Sedgemoor District Council Community Scrutiny Committee. The meeting's been held under the recent government regulations brought in to allow for remote meetings to take place and to allow for legislative decisions to be made. It's requested that all participants of the meeting turn off their mobile phones to off or silent. Hopefully those present will hear the meeting. However, in the event of a technical failure, the Chairman will adjourn the meeting and set a new time to reinstate the meeting. Please note that the meeting is being recorded. All members of the committee should have their video on but will remain muted until the Chairman invites them to speak. If you wish to speak on an item or ask a question, please could you put it on the chat icon, and the Chairman can pick up any any requests. And the format of the meeting will be as per the agenda published, and a copy of the reports are all online as well. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, thank you, Leila. Just like to introduce members of the committee. We'll start off with officers. Rose, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. I'm Rose Stokes, Scrutiny Officer, and I can confirm I can see and hear everything.
Thank you. And Dorothy, our Legal Services.
Good afternoon. I confirm that I can hear and see everything, and I'm Legal Advisor to this committee.
Thank you. If we move now to members of the committee, if you could just introduce yourselves and the ward you represent and whether you can see and hear everything, that would be great. So first of all, Councillor Scott. I'm not sure we have Councillor Scott, have we?
No, Chairman, she doesn't seem to have logged in. I did send her the appointment earlier, so I will see if I can get hold of her again.
All right, thank you.
Okay,
I know she was having difficulties. Councillor Bartlett.
Hello, it's Councillor Bartlett here, Councillor for Dunware Ward. Just confirming that I can see and hear everything. Unfortunately, you can probably see me. I'm looking a bit of a wreck, sorry.
Thank you. Councillor Betty, I think he's given his apologies for the start of the meeting, hasn't he? Yeah.
That's correct, Chairman. I think he's hoping to join sometime after 3.
Okay. Councillor Bradford.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Afternoon, everybody. Councillor Alan Bradford, representing North Pleasant Ward, and I can hear you loud and clear. I can't see nothing. I've had a bad morning. To be frank, the start of the afternoon like this is really winding me up. So look out this afternoon.
Oh, well, hopefully.
Well done, Madam Chairman. Well done.
Can you not see any? We can't see you, but can you not see us?
I can see Alexia. I can see Kathy. I can see Dorothy. I can see Leila.
Oh, that's all right then. That's all right.
It.
So you should be able to see the presentation.
Yes, not too bad.
That's
not
all
too
right
bad.
Then. Okay. Thank you. Councillor Crowe. No, it doesn't look like he's here. Councillor Gibson.
Councillor Lee Gibson, Eastover, Ward, Bridgewater. Yeah, I've been having some difficulties in and out and things, and I haven't got the chat function, it seems, because I tried to message just now. So just to let you know that I haven't got the chat. It's got like a dotted box around all the, like for my video, I don't think was showing for a while. I was informed by somebody, but I've got like a box around each icon and each the video and the audio and the visual and the red button is all a bit strange.
Okay, all right.
Just letting you know that it's a bit strange.
It's going to be a good
I think
afternoon.
it's the atmospheric pressure on for everybody. But
okay, thanks for letting me know, Lee. We'll
I'm back on song, Madam Chairman.
I can see you. That's lovely.
Right, here we go. Now we're on song. Look out now. Right.
Okay, just go through the rest of the members, and then we'll see if anybody else has got problems with the chat box. So, Councillor Godwin Pearson.
I'm here. I can see you guys.
Thank you.
I couldn't get in either. Actually, another member very kindly instant messaged me in or video conferenced me in. I can't.
You're on mute. And
Hi.
you're on mute.
Yeah, no, I'm having technical problems as well. I can't get into Outlook or anything today. So.
Okay, we're doing well. Maybe Andrew can, in the background, be just seeing if anybody, or you, Layla, seeing if there's anybody else trying to get in. I'm sure you are. Councillor Harvey.
Hi, Chairman. I can see and hear everybody, but you can't see me because my video is not working.
Okay, at least we can hear you, and and you can see.
Is working.
You can see everything. That's
I can see
guess
everything.
the main thing. Rightio. Thank you. Councillor Rodriguez.
Hello. Yep, I can see and hear Bridgewater Ward.
Okay, thanks. You're not coming through ever so clearly, but hopefully that will resolve itself as it goes along. Thank you. And finally, Councillor Wong. No, I don't think he's here yet. Anyway, now I'd like to just to introduce our speakers for the afternoon, just so that you know who's here and doing what. So, first of all, could I introduce Steve Muse from Somerset Climate Action Network, who will be doing our first presentation today. Steve, would you just like to come on screen if you can and just introduce yourself?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, hello everybody. My first scrutiny committee, so this is exciting for me. So yes, I work with my day job at Somerset Wildlife Trust, but I also run Somerset Climate Action Network, which is mostly what I'll be talking to you all about today.
Thank you very much. And Stuart Howlett is here. I'm sure you all know Stuart. Stuart, just to check you're in communication with us.
Yes, hi, Chairman. I'm here as Stuart Howlett, Assistant Director for Inward Investment and Growth, good start, which covers the planning and the economic development sides of it. And I'm going to run through a very brief presentation on the planning white paper. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Teresa Harvey. Teresa, are you with us?
I am with you. I'll just put my video on to prove that I am with you. Yeah, Teresa Harvey, Assistant Director for Housing, Communities and Wellbeing, and in here to help and support Anna, who's put all this strategy together.
Excellent. Thank you very much. And last but not least, Anna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Uh-oh.
Was she there? Where's she gone?
She was having...
Sorry, classic, I was on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Sorry about
I
that.
see you.
I'm Anna Mears. I'm the Climate Emergency Graduate Support, and I'll be talking to you about our Climate Emergency Strategy Action Plan and supporting evidence today.
Thank you. Thank you. And I see there are a number of other councillors here as well, and I'd like to welcome you all. And please let me know if you'd like to say anything during the course of the meeting. So we'll move on to the agenda proper now. And first of all, have we any apologies for absence?
No, Chairman, just Councillor Betty will be joining us later.
Okay, thank you. And minutes of previous meetings within your packs. You will have seen minutes for the meetings held on 14th of October, seems a long, long time ago, 18th of November and 10th of February. I'll take that as a whole, unless anybody has got any corrections for any of those minutes. If I hear nothing, I'll assume all is well and move on to the next item, which is urgent business. I'm not aware that we have any, Layla, of...
No, Chairman.
No, thank you. And public speaking time, we have no members of the public wishing to speak today. And next on to declarations of interest. Is that... No, I don't think there are any. And just to say, that's reminded me, Layla, if anybody wishes to speak, if you could let me know in the chat box, and for those of you who don't have the chat box facility, I think you'll just have to shout. Okay, so we'll proceed as well as we can under difficult circumstances today. So then we'll go on to the main and only item of today's agenda, which is Sedgemoor District Council's Climate Emergency Strategy. Since Sedgemoor declared a climate emergency, work has been ongoing on developing a strategy, which sits alongside the county-wide strategy, which unfortunately we can't reveal to you until a few weeks' time. But I think this is the first time this has been to committee in this form, so I look forward to the debate that continues. But first of all, I'd like to introduce Steve Muse, who will be I've invited Steve to sort of set some context for the climate emergency, because it's concerned me for some time that we really need to know the impact for Sedgemoor, firstly, and wider, when we're considering our climate emergency strategy. So Steve, the Somerset Climate Action Network has been doing a lot of work on that. So Steve, I'd like to sort of invite you to start your presentation, please.
Okay, thank you, Chair. That's fantastic. Well, let's try and get the technology to work, and then if we've got a backup if it doesn't.
Can I just suggest that we allow Steve to make his presentation, and we'll take questions at the end, I think, just in case your questions are answered during the course of it.
That's great. Thanks, Kathy. Okay, well, I'm trying to share it. We might have to go to your backup later if there's any problems. Yeah, I think I might be breaking the system. Shall we use your desktop, Lou? Is that okay? I'll stop sharing here. I'm quite glad I didn't put any videos in his presentation. That really would have brought the whole thing down, I think.
Is somebody taking care of the presentation?
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to unmute myself to say that I'm just gonna start presenting. Hold on 1 minute.
All right, thank you.
Thanks, Layla.
When you're a bit brain dead,
I've got a note on mine saying that Andrew Malhewish is causing us all the problems. It says here, you might notice some features aren't available because Andrew Malhewish isn't using Skype for Business.
Poor Andrew, he's getting the blame for everything today.
Yeah. He'll get me back, don't worry.
Right, let's see if I can.
I think Rose said she has it as well, Lena, if it's a problem.
Yeah.
Good job, he ain't Prime Minister. I'd be really bored then. God blimey. Eh? There you go.
Oh, primary monitor.
Difficult time for everyone at the moment.
Bear with me 1 minute.
Hopefully we'll be all right once we get going.
Can you see?
Right. Are we off? It's loading.
Can you see?
Not yet.
But...
Right, now it is.
Yeah.
All right, here we go.
Steve,
Fantastic.
you just need to say to me, next slide or something similar. Okay.
Well, okay, that's fantastic. Thank you. So, hello everybody, and thanks for allowing me to speak to you today. So, if you want to go to the next slide there, Layla. So, as I said at the start, I work for Somerset Wildlife Trust, but I actually run and we set up Somerset Climate Action Network about 18 months ago, and we've been trying to basically help the county in whatever way we can to sort of get up to speed on what's happening with climate change and what we can do to help it. So why me? That's a big question and a large picture of a whale there. So a little bit about the background. I'm Sedgemoor born and bred, lived in Wedmore for most of my life. And I wear many hats. So I set up Green Wedmore back in 2006. I chair Wedmore Community Power Co-op, and we've got a 1 megawatt solar farm in Wedmore, which we look after. I also chair Reimagining the Levels Group and Somerset Climate Action Network. And as I say, my day job is with campaigns and policy at Somerset Wildlife and one of the big projects I have there is looking at adapting the levels, which is adaptation pathways work. Oh, Layla, we seem to have switched back to. Oh, here we go. Great. Okay. So why now? And I'll warn you, everybody, now. This is a quick romp through climate change. So I hope you're hanging on to your seats here, everybody. So why now? So the global and climate emergencies are happening. They are here. You don't have to switch on the news very far to see about bushfires in California or Australia or the Amazon, and lots of other things like melting ice caps. So it's definitely here, and we have to cope with it. And scientists are telling us now that we have to act now. If we're going to prevent runaway global climate change, we really have to make a lot of changes to our lifestyles in the next 10 years. And action can be taken at all levels, with individuals, communities, governments, industry, everything. And also COVID the crisis has reminded us not only of how fragile society can be and the economy, but also that how quickly we can swing into action to tackle a situation when we need to. So that's something to bear in mind to keep us positive. I think we'll go to the next slide, Layla. Thanks. So the presentation, I'm going to do literally about 2 slides on the Earth's changing climate, and then quickly into climate change projections, impacts. Why is it an emergency? Why is it more than just about climate change? So looking at biodiversity and about nature, and then going into the local. So looking at the local impacts of this emergency, and also some of the national and local responses that we've made. Okay, next slide. And again, so Earth's changing climate. Right, so why is it called the greenhouse effect? Basically because the planet acts like a giant greenhouse. So the sunlight comes in, and once it gets into the atmosphere, it rebounds out again as infrared heat energy, which is partly reflected by the glass in this analogy, but it's our atmosphere. And that is the strength of that greenhouse effect is strengthened by CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases that are emitted. So that's why people keep talking about why we need to cut CO2. Okay, next slide, Leila. And just to give you some background there, this is some since 1900 what's happened to annual emissions of greenhouse gases, or well, of CO2, and showing the steep curve upwards. But also slightly disencouragingly, it showed when you got back in 1990 or whatever, when the International Panel on Climate Change was formed, and then the Kyoto Protocol. These are all climate treaties, international climate treaties. Copenhagen in about 2005, the Paris Agreement in 2015, none of which led to actually a decrease in CO2. The only thing that's led to a decrease in CO2 recently has been COVID. But again, it does show how things can change. Okay, next slide, Leila. Now, this is a useful graphic I always find, just showing temperature changes since 1850 up to almost the present day. The redder lines are for warmer temperatures, obviously, looking throughout the whole world. And again, it just graphically shows how much temperatures have increased over the last 150, 170 years. Okay, next slide, Leila. So, climate change projections and impacts. So, how's this all going to affect us? So CO2 levels projections, I won't go into too much detail about this because as I say it's just a romp through the issues, but the historical emissions line there, you see the red line on the left takes us up to roughly the present day with that vertical black line. And then the graph beyond that is looking at different projections. So if we do business as usual, do you want to go back one, Leila? Sorry. If we have business as usual, we'll be into that red territory where temperature rises will most scientists say will go up to between 4 or 5 degrees increase in temperature by 2100. And even in current policies, which is around the Paris Climate Accord, if we follow all those, we'll still be looking at 3 to 3.7. And so the target is to try to get to the 1.5 or 2 degrees increases, which is those bottom darker, little light grey lines. That's the target if we're going to try to reduce carbon dioxide and hopefully reduce the worst effects of climate change. Okay, next slide, Leila. So again, this is looking at the same situation, but with temperature rather than CO2 emissions. And again, those different lines are CPA, don't worry about too much of those. They're different sort of scenarios which are set up by the International Panel on Climate Change to look at different scenarios about what may happen. and clearly we need to aim for the best possible scenario and keep temperatures as well below 2 or 1.5 as we can. Okay, thanks, Leila. And then sea level, close to the heart of Sedgemoor, obviously. Historically, sea level, at least over the last 200 years or so, hasn't changed that much. It's been creeping up more over the last 100 years or so. We've gone up about a centimetre or two in the last 100 years. But all the predictions are saying that over the next 100 years it's likely to increase quite sharply, and I'll show you later on some slides about what that means exactly for Sedgemoor. But that's the worrying part for where we live in this part of the world. Okay, next slide, Leila. Now, melting ice caps, this is one of these things called, it's called a positive feedback loop, which is rather strange because it's not positive at all, it's quite scary. But this is to do with some systems in nature where something triggers something else and you get this sort of loop effect. So as temperatures rise, and they have been rising especially high, something like 3 degrees above normal, up in Greenland and the Arctic, obviously the sea ice and the Greenland ice cap is melting quite fast, and especially when the sea ice melts, it exposes more dark ocean, which then reflects less water, less heat rather, and so warms up quicker, which then causes temperature to rise, which then melts more sea ice, and you get this sort of loop effect, which is quite worrying. Okay, next slide, Leah.
Okay, thanks very much. Thank you.
Okay, so the ocean heat lag effect, this is to do with built-in climate change effectively. So scientists are now quite confident that the sea has been absorbing a lot of the carbon dioxide and temperature increases over the last few decades. And what it means is that we feel the effects of climate emissions that we actually emitted some 30, 40, 50 years ago. So the weather patterns we're seeing now and the bushfires in California and Australia and Amazon relate to emissions and stuff that came out of the back of our exhaust pipes back in the late 70s, which is quite sobering when you think, right, we really better get on with this and reduce our CO2 because we ain't going to be feeling the effects of this for decades in advance. So it just concentrates the mind a little more. Next slide, please. Okay, so why is it a climate emergency? Right, so why nearly 10 years, as I spoke about earlier? This really comes from the International Panel on Climate Change's reports about how to keep below 1.5 or at worst 2 degrees of temperature increase. And to do that, we need to drastically reduce our CO2 emissions. And we have the longer we delay, we have less and less time in which to do this. And that graph shows how quickly we need to rapidly decarbonize, as they say, so that we can actually start to reduce the carbon in the atmosphere. And it's not to say, I should temper this and caveat this, to not say that carbon dioxide is not good. It's just that we're putting too much into it thanks to mankind's influence. We all need carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, otherwise plants wouldn't grow and we wouldn't grow any food. But what's happening is that thanks to mankind, we're emitting loads more by burning of fossil fuels and so forth. Okay, next slide, please, Leila. So, climate change. Yeah, next slide. So even if we cut greenhouse gas emissions to zero overnight, we continue to degrade the biosphere and the planet will die a death of a million cuts, by Charles Einstein. Next slide. And I'm sure a lot of you saw the recent David Attenborough program that he had Sunday night, about 10 days ago, which was pretty sobering. He does those so well. And those are just some figures there about some of the declines we're seeing in animals around the world. Probably one of the scariest ones, I'll go on to some more slides in a minute, but probably one of the scariest ones that reflects Sedgemoor and Somerset is around insects. Somerset Wildlife Trust has a big campaign trying to protect and restore our insect life. Absolutely vital for pollinating our crops, especially our apple trees. We don't want to get rid of our cider harvest here in Somerset. But also it's the bedrock of all life on Earth. So if we lose our insects, then we're going to be in a very sorry state. Okay, next slide, Leila. And that's one example of it. People in the environmental world use these horrible languages like shifting baseline. And all that means is that as things change in our environment, sometimes we don't realize until later on. I mean, I can still remember very, very clearly 20, 30, 40 years ago when I used to go on holiday down to Cornwall, our windscreen would look like that after about 3 or 4 hours of driving. whereas these days it's less and less case, and we strongly suspect that's due to far, far fewer insects. In fact, I went up to Scotland a few months ago on work and drove up, and it was really noticeable how going up the motorway, the windscreen was absolutely fine, almost to a point when we actually crossed the border into Somerset. We were noticing masses of more insects, probably for midget season, but it's an interesting comparison at least. So next slide, Leila. So habitat destruction. We do cause a lot of havoc around habitat in this world. Those figures around the side there don't really reflect Somerset so much with deforestation or mangrove destruction, but some local examples of what we do. Development, which we're going to come on to talk about later, and the planning white paper. Peat extraction that still goes on in the levels and moors. Peat, for example, is an amazing asset we have in Somerset. It locks up a hell of a lot of carbon. And the best thing to do is kind of like having our own amazing bit of natural capital in Somerset. And the best thing with peat is to keep it wet and keep it in the ground. Unfortunately, we're still digging it up. So that's an issue which we tackle with at the Wildlife Trust. But even little things like hedgerow management can affect it. Hedgerows are fantastic for wildlife. And if they're managed in a slightly different way, they can really restore wildlife in that area. And hedgerows are like the motorways for nature. Okay, next slide, Leila. So local impacts of a climate and ecological emergencies. So Somerset, as you all know, especially Sedgemoor, of course, which is the best part of Somerset, has some amazing landscapes, some beautiful wildlife, and some incredible scenes. I apologise for the parts of the photos there that are not in Sedgemoor, but they all come from Somerset, I can promise you. But of course, in Sedgemoor we have the amazing otters there, we have snipe, we have incredible wildlife. And so what we're trying to do is to bring that back where we can and preserve what we have. Yeah, next slide. So just some images which won't be of any surprise to you all. Flooding there, top left, and to the bottom there as well from 2013-14. And on the right, just showing some sort of flood risk maps, which is just emphasising how much on the front line Sedgemoor especially is. Okay, next slide. So of course we have a massive tidal range on the Severn Estuary, one of the highest ranges in the world. And Somerset's topography does not lend itself to staying dry when we have a high tide and a storm surge and heavy rainfall. The middle of Somerset acts like a giant bowl, so we have a slightly raised area along the coastline, Burnham and Highbridge and so on, and then you go down in level, down into the levels, and we're surrounded by the Mendips and the Blackdowns and so on. So a lot of water comes off the hills and a lot of high tides come in from the sea, and we have sea defences and so on. But the tidal range and fluvial flooding is probably one of the biggest climate risks to Sedgemoor. And climate change is likely to bring stronger storm events and bigger storm surge. So again, that's something we need to be very mindful of. Okay, next slide. So we've been doing a lot of research as part of Somerset Climate Action Network, but also as part of Adapting the Levels, which is this climate adaptation project. And we've been looking very closely. There's a lot of sort of jargon in there. I do apologise. UKCP 18 is a United Kingdom Climate Projection 2018 report produced by the Met Office. And that's been telling us that we can expect a sea level rise, and this is a big range, but a sea level rise of between 0.27 and 1.13 metres by 2100. And there's a higher scenario, that high plus, which is saying we may have 2 metres by 2100. And in fact, since that UKCP 18 was published, the UN has published more data, which says we should increase all those figures by 10%. Interestingly, Hinkley Point C is planned and is defended for a 2 metre high plus scenario, which is quite encouraging at least. And then we're also planning for a possible tsunami of up to 13 metres. So if we get a high storm surge, head to Hinkley Point C. But these storm surges can be really, really dangerous when they're combined with high water levels in our marine systems and so forth. And scientists now suspect that the 1607 tsunami that was used to be called a tsunami, they reckon was a storm surge now. but also peak river flows. So climate change is likely to bring about 40% higher peak river flows over and above the 13, 14 levels that we had. That's going to be much more likely by the end of the century. So that's something we've really got to watch for. So in the industry, we best practice is to prepare for these high plus scenarios, because this data does change quite quickly. It doesn't tend to change in the right direction. Okay, next slide. So Somerset vulnerabilities, so river flooding, obviously, and we don't need reminding from that. So there's been a lot of work done since the 13-14 floods. Communities are a lot more resilient. There's been a lot of work being done by the various local authorities, which has been really good. But this 1 metre figure for the sea level rise, that's what SLR stands for, sea level rise, the key one. So it's what we do and how we plan for what we do beyond that 1 metre rise is going to be really important. Most of our flood defences along the coast are rated to 1 metre, so there's lots of interesting discussions going on with the Environment Agency and so on about how we actually defend our countryside and our houses in that period. Okay, next slide. So just quickly here, we've just did some figures here on what the effect will be on our insects if temperature starts to rise too much. So the darker greens are where we're close to 100% of roughly where we are now with our insect life, and then the lighter figures, and when it goes into the yellows and the reds, show what happens as we get warmer. So at 1.5 degree rise, which we're almost certainly going to hit within 10 years or so, we're starting to get some lighter green areas around the Sedgemoor area. And if you can go to the next slide, Lola. So when we get to 2 degrees, it's starting to get a lot more yellow. And then the next slide, I think, is at 3 degrees. Oh no, I saved you that scary scenario. So some more climate change impacts on nature in Somerset. So we're already noticing UK dormice are in danger of extinction, and their numbers have been plummeting. So that's something we're closely monitoring within the trust. Hedgehogs are another classic one. So they really struggle in dry summers because they have less food to eat. Jellyfish invasions on West Country beaches are supposed to be more likely. So nature has lots of different challenges. And again, I've already spoken about the insects. So next slide. I'm conscious I might be running out a bit of time here, so I better speed up a little bit. So next slide. So there's lots of things that have been happening. So the UK nationally has a Climate Change Act that was signed in 2008, so we were quite ahead of the time back in those days. It was pretty good. And currently the government has set a target of reaching net zero by 2050. And the key committee there to watch out for, if you follow these things closely, that Committee for Climate Change, CCC, who advise the government, they're very, very good and produce some excellent reports. And so it's one worth looking out for. Okay, next slide. Somerset County Council, as you know, declared a climate emergency at a similar time to when Sedgemoor did, pledged to make Somerset carbon neutral by 2030. And working with local partners, and as Kathy's already discussed, their strategy will be coming out soon. And it also assists communities to become more resilient to the impacts, and they've just launched their £1 million climate fund, which is going to be very useful locally. Okay, next slide. And also the district councils, as you know, declared climate emergencies and pledged to be net zero by 2030. 2 districts also declared ecological emergencies, and I believe Somerset West and Taunton are about to vote on their next full council meeting, and if Sedgemoor wants to do the same, I'm happy to help. And also all the district councils and county councils have pledged to write to local MPs and ministers calling for powers to make 2030 possible. I think everyone recognises that districts and county have only so much resource and influence to be able to solve a problem on their own. And then there's different projects, as we can talk about later on, about cycling and walking and renewable energy and so on. Okay, next slide. That just shows where we're at with Somerset. So those are the CO2 emissions since 2005 in Somerset, and you'll see that actually they've been doing a healthy decline up to the last year, and that mirrors pretty much the national picture, largely because of energy decarbonisation. So as we've closed our coal-fired power stations around the country, our energy system has become a lot less emitting. Okay, next slide. Okay, so what can a town, parish or community do? A heck of a lot, and as we've already mentioned, some parishes have already declared climate emergencies themselves, including Wedmore and lots of North Peverton and lots of others. And also we're writing to local ministers and MPs is always useful, community workshops. And really just working together as a team. We've been, let's say, Green Wedmore's been around since 2006, and it takes a while, but you can quickly get to know what you can do at a local level, and there's lots of other organisations and lots of other communities doing the same thing. So part of Somerset Climate Action Network is to help to share that best practice and to help communities to empower them to do more. So next slide. And here we go, just showing quick wins. Creating a strategy that's doable is important, so that people stay engaged and stay motivated and upbeat. It's when giving these sort of presentations as well, it's a tricky balance to saying, look, this is a really tricky situation. We're in a lot of trouble here, but there's a lot we can do. Okay, next slide. And then a bit more about Somerset Climate Action Network. We have a membership scheme, which is all free, our Action Networker scheme, and we're keen to ensure an evidence-based approach. So we've created a lot of reports that you can look on our website and have a look at, which are looking at the Somerset level about where we are and how we can get to zero carbon. Okay, next slide. A classic climate change cartoon that you'll see in a lot of them. What if we create, sustainability and green jobs and livable cities and fresh air and clean water, if climate change is a hoax. All these things, all climate change actions and mitigation, in my view, are positive. And so it's a win-win situation, basically. Okay, next slide. And just to show that there's lots of different groups and people doing things around Somerset, lots of different learning to be had between, and we do all talk to each other and swap good practice. Okay, next slide. Good old Greta Thunberg, you can't have a climate slide without her as well, and bless her, love her or hate her, she can get people stirred up, which I think part of it is about. And if you ever a chance to read some of her speeches in full as well, she's incredible, very, very well researched, and she knows her stuff and puts it across. Okay, next slide. Okay, there we go. That was a very quick romp. Sorry if I've gone over time, Chair, but happy to take any questions if we have time.
Many thanks, Steve. I think that's a really sobering message, but very necessary for us to hear. I'd just like to welcome Councillors Crow and Wong. Thank you. I'm glad you're able to join us. I think we lost at some point Councillor Godwin Pearson, although we may be back now. But
thank you, Chair. Yes, it said I had no meetings today.
Oh. Good to see you.
Well, I knew it was on, but I said it had no meetings.
Oh, well, you made it.
Thanks.
You made it.
I made it after much trouble. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Councillor Keane, please indicate in the chat box if you have any questions for Steve. And if you have no chat box, please make yourself known. Councillor Keane.
Oh, thank you, Chairman, and thank you to Mr. Muse. That really was a deeply thought-provoking programme. In amongst the papers that were issued for this committee, there was one document. I think it's still in draft form. It's the pollinator booklet. It's published by the County Council. Our own ecologist, Pete Granger, has been a contributor towards it, and I would strongly advise everyone to read it because the statistics in it, they are scary, but they are accurate. And the papers on this meeting in the various appendices, they do mention things. I don't think it helps to frighten people rigid, but of all the local activities that's mentioned here in our appendices, you've got things like gardens and allotments, and you don't need a half-acre patch to have a garden. Some of the gardens we're judging locally, they're just pots on patios in a very confined space, but it's growing things. And the principle that I find most helpful to get this message out is small steps. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with one footstep. And if 1,000 people just made that one little footstep, some of the statistics, such as the domestic emissions in the grids that was published, that could be reduced considerably. But thank you so much for being with us today. It is your information is absolutely critical, and I welcome it. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Councillor Keane. Yeah, there'll be opportunities to, we'll be going through the Sedgemoor's strategy and action plan later in the meeting, so there'll be more chance to pick up on those individuals. But I think the thing that seemed important to me was to have evidence-based information in the context of which we will need to make future decisions. And following from today, my intention is that one of the recommendations from this committee will be that we invite Steve Muse or Somerset Climate Action Network to provide training to all councillors so that everybody has the benefits of this presentation. And whilst the information is worrying, I don't want to, it's about how we, knowing the facts, and then so that will help us in future decision making to mitigate against the effects. So Councillor Bradford, you wanted to speak.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you, Steve, for that information you granted us. Thank you very much. First of all, I picked two or three things up, actually. First of all, a bit political to start with. District councils, you mentioned, are getting involved in all this. But if the county council has their way, there won't be no district councils. So there'll be an awful lot of pressure on local town and parish councils and the county council itself, which I say that they won't be capable of doing, right? Secondly, I do know what you're talking about. I've got a little bit of land on the Somerset levels, and I was heavily involved in the moorland flood scheme some 10, 12 years ago when these things happened. And I tend to farm in the same way as I've always done, to be honest, and I think that's very important. But my big question is, what are we all going to give up? Everybody's on about all this, and my big question to North Petherton was when we voted to do this strategy, which is very important for North Petherton because that's the area we live in. We're surrounded by low land. What are we all going to give up? If we all decide we're going to give up something, and this COVID job, it's having one heck of an effect on an awful lot of things, and it may well be in future years we may well see a lot of these aeroplanes grounded forever, and things like that. And sometimes nature got a great way of presenting itself, and this may be one of them. And if anybody reads the Bible, and I'm not a vicar, by the way, right? All these fires were forecast. Okay. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I had to get it in.
Councillor Bradford.
That's all right.
Very Old Testament.
We're not going down the rabbit hole of religion this afternoon.
No, I'm just stating the fact.
Moving swiftly on. Councillor Godwin Pearson.
Thank you. Is Steve still in the room?
Yes. I hope. Yes. I can see you.
Steve, I'm really sorry. I've had technical problems this afternoon, as you probably saw. I missed the very beginning, and then I had the blue screen of death. The computer just literally crashed entirely, and it took me about 10 or 15 minutes to get it back up. So I missed a little bit in the middle, but I think I got the gist. And actually, this is a topic about which I've researched and written quite a lot. It's of great concern to me. My questions are, it strikes me that there's a lot of this stuff that really is down to national government. The agriculture bill that's going through the Lords at the minute, and the environment bill that's been postponed. I think it goes to public committees, the Public Bills Committee this week. I think there's not that much that local authorities can do, I don't think, apart from, well, I suppose there's some planning things, aren't there, that we can do to encourage wild habitats. But really, I think this comes down to engaging with local residents to change the way that we live our lives, and more than that, to think about the way that to think about our relationship between our own consumption and nature. So have you seen any examples, and there was one in Enfield, wasn't there, where Enfield Council have decided to only provide vegetarian and vegan food at public events from Christmas? That's it. They're stopping providing meat and dairy largely because of the effect of intensive agriculture. But is there anything that actively that local authorities can do to assist with this, and how can local authorities nudge consumers into making choices that are better for the environment and better for health and ultimately better for small farmers?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Thanks, Graham. And it'd be a shame we missed half a presentation. I'll send it to you, Graham, so you can see it another time. No, it's a really good question. A couple of answers. One thing, we did a report early on, Somerset Climate Action Network, on the different things that councils can do. And also, it's interesting when you look at the draft county strategy as well as Sedgemoor strategy, how much is possible, how much is doable. I completely agree that national government needs to do a heck of a lot more. If you're a sad person like me that uses Twitter sometimes, you might have noticed me. There's an organisation called, and I don't want to get political here either, but Conservatives for Environment Network.
Yeah, I'm a member actually.
You're a member, yeah, and they do great work. I went to one of the events last year, and they did a video recently about Extinction Rebellion. And David Warburton, one of our local MPs, spoke on that, and I tweeted to him and I said, David, because I've spoken to him before about these issues, and I know he strongly believes that this is an incredibly big problem and we need to do a lot more, and I know he believes that his government is doing, very well. So I was trying to get across to him that there seems to be this gulf between on the ground what we know needs to happen and what is happening nationally, and how do we actually broach, how do we get across? And I think the climate asks of government from district and from county will be really, really important. And I think enough counties and districts do go to government and say, look, we need to do this, and this, and there's only so much we can do, but what's the latest on this issue and that issue, then hopefully we can get some progress. But there's a lot we can do locally with food. I mean, a lot of stuff with districts and stuff and counties is setting out examples. I know you guys have been doing good work with your canteen in the office, and sourcing from local food and things like this, and food larder project with Hinckley and things like this are really important. Shopping locally, not wasting so much food locally, things like this are stuff that we can encourage. But also to help encourage our local food supplies. We've got some innovative stuff in Somerset as well, which is exciting. So I live nearby to a bio-aqua farm, I don't know if you've seen, which is a very exciting way of producing organic fish and vegetables in the same closed loop system, which uses a tiny amount of land, is ideal for brownfield sites and what have you, in places like Bridgewater or Highbridge or anywhere else might have a bit of spare land somewhere. You can actually produce top quality food and vegetables without needing necessarily large amounts of area. So there's lots of projects, there's lots of initiatives, and also the food work stream of climate strategy, which Somerset have almost published. I think you'll find quite interesting. So yes, the stuff we could do, yes, to do more, but yeah.
Thank you for that. As we go through the meeting, we go through the strategy. We'll be looking in depth of what has been done already and what we aspire to do. And yeah, I noticed Councillor Keen's comments, and Councillor Slocum, would you like to speak?
Thank you very much, Chairman. Thank you very much, Steve. Yes, it was very thought-provoking. Although it's uppermost in our minds all the time, it's nothing like listening to an expert who can actually define it the way you've done. So I thank you for that. I wanted to ask you about with COVID, we've obviously not been on the road, or we hadn't been on the road so much. And I'd noticed a massive impact in our environment, in our air quality and everything else by not having any cars on the road, and transport. And obviously planes, the sky was pretty good and it looked good. How much impact would that have? Would you be able to say if this continued? Because that was the one thing that many people have said to me. Isn't the air good with having no cars? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Slocum, and good to see you again. Yes, no, local information, the actual specific to Somerset on that sort of issues I haven't seen yet. But what usually happens is that these sort of reports, and people will be scurrying away trying to measure impacts of air pollution and so on at the moment. So I imagine these will bubble to the surface and we'll see them pop up online soon. But I'm sure it will show drops. I think I saw I remember seeing some satellite images of places like Milan and Beijing and London comparing with the same period of the year before. And it was staggering, the improvements in air quality. So, yeah, in a horrible situation like COVID, at least it does show us another way of living and thinking which is beneficial for all of us. And I think being able to talk and still do good business and good work like this, whilst not having to leave our houses, can be good up to a point. So, yeah. But if I find any other good local examples, I'll send it round to everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I'd also like to, I noticed that Councillor Betty has now been able to join us, and Councillor Scott, welcome. Hello. You'd like to say something?
Yes, thank you, Chairman. Sorry, I had trouble getting in, but I'm here now. Yeah, I mean, the debate about what we should eat is great. Sedgemoor itself, we've got to look at our landscape, and that was a very interesting debate that Steve has just presented. And because he's to do with the Somerset Trust as well, he'll know the value of our farmed landscape on the Mendip Hills and also on the moorlands. The hill land is only sort of fit for grazing livestock. Because of the topography. So we should share factually correct information about this, how sustainable and how livestock farming should actually help manage the countryside, plus the benefit of red meat and a balanced diet. I know that will come up later, and I may have to declare an interest as being a beef farmer, but I hope not. But one of the questions I'd like to ask Steve is there was talk of maybe the district council becoming announcing an ecological emergency. So the climate debate and ecology should go hand in hand, and basically all our systems need to be working. And I just think that we should actually go down that route as well within our climate emergency, because it will have benefit for the county as a whole, or the district as a whole. So I don't know whether the other thing I'd like to, on the first slide that he gave, nitrogen was very high on the chart, and I think that's emitted from, our cars. So we should be looking at definitely reducing our car travel. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Councillor Scott. Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I'm not a vegan, I'm not a vegetarian, but the meat I do eat is I only get from local sources, so so that we can support local farmers. And I think the biggest danger with some of the scares that come out on the news regarding meat eating is regarding sort of huge feedlots in America and places which are so far from a natural way to look after an animal. It's not true. But I think we've got so many good examples of good local food production in Somerset that we can support and be part of. So yeah, fantastic. And obviously I'm biased, but I would obviously support an ecological emergency declaration.
Thank you. Councillor Crowe.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Very interesting presentation, and certainly is action's got to be taken. But I was just wondering, expanding it a little further into the international scene, we have countries like China and America who are pumping out vast quantities of these toxic gases. And I just wondered, how do your figures relate to what actually they're doing, and to what responses you're getting or that people are getting from those countries regarding the control of these gases?
Yeah, thank you, Councillor. That's a question we get a lot, actually. The answer sort of falls into at least 2 or 3 parts. Partly, you're right that the UK's share of greenhouse gas emissions is tiny. I think it's something like 1 or 2% of the world now. But we have the 5th something like fifth or sixth biggest economy in the world. And the dichotomy there is, of course, that we import a lot of the manufactured goods that used to be made in our country. So, and a lot of it from China or India. So there's a lot of things, there's a thing called consumption emissions. So, we're actually buying produce which might have a high emission rate in India and ship it into, or China, ship it into this country, and it's not counted as part of our thing. So I think we need to help other countries like that, help them along the way. But the other answer I would give is a legacy. So as the UK was the first to industrialise in the sort of 1760s or so, we were burning coal for longer than anybody. So it's kind of like, sort of a legacy that we were so much a bigger part of a problem for so long. We kind of owe it to a world to be an exemplar in the future, is the way I would look at it.
Thank you for that. Yes, I think part of this process is raising awareness and information for people to make choices on the things they buy. And there's so much rubbish that's literally shipped around the world, creating emissions and causing pollution. This is all part of the process about addressing that, I think. Right, the question Councillor Gibson, did you just wish to make that point, or would you like to speak as well?
Yeah, I suppose I could say, I think Graham was in front of me, but
oh yeah, sorry.
No, I mean I think it's around 12% of soy that comes from the Amazon that comes into animal feeds in this country, and it is about, I guess, smaller farms and larger farms. But I would totally disagree with Councillor Scott on some of the points she's raised there, and with Steve and with Mr. Muse as well about what he's brought up. But
okay, thank you for those comments. Councillor Godwin Pearson.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, and I mean, I just wanted to say, actually, one of the biggest issues I think we have in this country is that we don't factor in emissions we create in other countries to feed our intensive animals. So I'm not talking about Liz's small herd of beef cattle that are raised outside. I'm talking about the enormous mega farms that have thousands and thousands and thousands of animals in them, and 90% of the soy that's grown in that's grown in land cleared from rainforest in Brazil. And by the way, Brazil's irrigation system accounts for 70% of global water use. That's an incredible statistic. And that 90% of that soy doesn't go to feed local people, where there are millions who are starving in Brazil. It goes across the other side of the world to feed those enormous mega farms in Britain and in the States and in Australia and other parts of Europe and so on. And I can thoroughly recommend. I just jumped out of my chair to grab this book by a chap called Philip Limbury and Isabel Oxshott, who's a Conservative commentator. It's called Farmageddon, and I can very much recommend this to anybody because it really does show how the carbon output, the emissions that we have from this country are small, but we contribute to the emissions of other countries because of our consumption. And it's the cheap meat that's the problem, So I can definitely recommend read Farmageddon if you can, because it'll give you an absolutely fascinating background, all cited and really well researched information on all of these things. And it certainly opened my eyes up to the way that we are, the way we're literally destroying other parts of the planet, in order to have much cheaper meat on our plates.
Okay. Thank you. What I'm going to say now at this point is I think we've given food production an airing for today, but I don't want us to get completely caught up on that. There are strong views, and I think if and when we do have that particular debate, we need some more information and evidence base on which to discuss it. I'll just put in a plug for a talk that's happening on Saturday afternoon that can be booked through the British Library, actually, with Professor Tim Lang of, I think he's at Imperial College London, who's talking about local food resilience and production. So for anybody who's interested. Right, I think that exhaust the questions, and I note Teresa's comment about the ecological emergency inclusion potentially. So thank you, and I'd like to take that up and look at that to be including that at some stage. I just have one question before we move on, and it's around the percentage, the degree temperature percentage that we need to achieve. And I sort of at this point in time struggle to understand how we reduce that, how we measure that. And I don't know if you've got any thoughts, comments on that, Steve.
How we reduce the temperature increase that we're trying to get to?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, they're global figures. So you hear sometimes that we've increased temperature by about 1.1 since the start of the Industrial Revolution, and the target that Paris sets us is to get below one, keep it to 1.5 or 2. And so we've only got 0.4 degrees increase before we hit that first target. So that's what they're measuring really, really closely. And I expect you've seen some of the I've got some things like the last 9 of the last 10 years since records began and all this sort of thing. So this is what we need to try to reduce, and this is a scary part about the climate lag, that the oceans have been absorbing so much of the heat and that we've been expelling so far, and they think that the oceans may not be able to absorb that much more before it begins to show in global air temperatures. So yeah, that's something we need to keep a very close on. And I was just going to say as well, I won't go back to the food, but food, as you say, is such a huge topic, and it's so hard to actually go into the detail and explain some of the nuts and bolts in the short reply. So.
Yeah, that's why I'm going to leave that particular topic here, and we can. Yeah. That's not to say we won't pick it up at a later date, but I think we've aired it well. Steve, I'd like to thank you for your presentation, for setting the scene for us, which I think is really necessary for us as councillors and policy makers. And I invite you to stay for the rest of the meeting and hope you find it interesting. But now I'd like to move on and introduce Stuart Howlett. Stuart, I've forgotten your title, but you know who you are.
Yes, don't worry. I head up the planning and economic development functions here at Sedgemoor.
Yeah, thank you, Steve. So I thought it was useful at this point because we've talked a lot about the context, but we're also operating within the planning system as well, and the white paper that's out that is causing some of us some concerns at this stage. But if you could talk us through the sort of different headings about it, the key headlines, I guess. And that will help inform us about what we've got ahead of us.
Sure, happy to do that. I think Layla's got a couple of slides. It's not many slides, 6, I think, to show, if Layla doesn't mind putting those up on the screen. I think the context is quite important, and anyone who's attended a planning committee recently, and I know some of you do sit on that committee, will know that the debate and discussion on climate change has become more prevalent in the debate on individual planning proposals and planning applications. So it's absolutely a growing issue for members. In terms of where we are as officers, we'll say that we have an adopted local plan. It's an up-to-date local plan. It includes policies within it that deals with climate change. It's based on national planning policy framework, which is also up to date, July 2019. So from our perspective, there isn't any change, or hasn't been any change at a national level in terms of planning policy that takes us in a different way, into perhaps a different way that members are expecting in terms of climate change. So the planning white paper is really interesting because it is the first opportunity that the government have put any reform in front of us since we've adopted the local plan, or since the national planning policy framework's been in place. So as I say, I've got a few slides. It will give a very brief overview of the suggested planning reforms. I'll try and draw out the linkages with climate change as I'm going along, but to be honest, I have to say, it doesn't feel like a central principle that runs through the document, and I'll come on and talk about some of the issues relating to that. I'll also caveat, though, that it's a consultation document. It sets out a policy direction, but not necessarily the detail. And of course, it's the detail that we're interested in, and that will, of course, come through subsequent regulation, policy, and statutory instruments. But there are also many other ways, perhaps more direct ways, of embedding climate change principles outside of the planning system, decarbonisation of transport being one, building regulations in terms of building fabric, and also the wider environmental laws. We talked about emissions, etc. as well. So it's important to recognise that planning won't deliver everything, but I think the white paper is quite an interesting view on where the government may be or may not be in terms of the link between planning and climate change. So turning to the slides then, so the white paper was published on the 6th of August, out for consultation until the end of the month, so 29th of October, sorry, the end of October, and I've put the link on the slide, though you've had it in your pack as well, I think. It sets out a wide-ranging fundamental reform of the planning system. It deals with revising the plan-making process, so how we produce and prepare local plans. Also tries to modernise planning by promoting a greater use of digital data and how we interact, so social media, etc., and those things, bringing that in. I mean, many of you will know that the planning system still relies on paper notices on lamp posts, so there's an opportunity to modernise those sort of things. It also picks up on the need to strengthen a focus on design quality and environmental outcomes, and as part of that, it is alluding towards some of the climate change and energy efficiency elements of buildings as well. So there are some aspects of climate change that come from that, but the detail, as I say, is a bit lacking. It also looks at how it deals with infrastructure funding, which again is another quandary that the planning system has been trying to deal with. Can I have the next slide, please, Layla? So I always like on white papers or documents, policy documents, to just look at the forward, because I think the forward sets the tone for the document. So I've got the two quotes, one from the Prime Minister at the top and the second one from the Secretary of State. Quite interesting tone, I think you'll say. I'll quickly read them. So, thanks to our planning system, we have nowhere near enough homes in the right places. People cannot afford to move to where their talents can be matched with opportunity. Business cannot afford to grow and create jobs. The whole thing is beginning to crumble, and the time has come to do what too many have for too long lacked the courage to do: tear it down and start again. So fairly damning indictment of the planning system. Interesting to note, it's about not delivering enough homes is one of the drivers for why we're not doing what the planning system should be doing, and about not allowing businesses or economic development to grow and create jobs. So quite a traditional view of what the planning system should be about, which is economic growth. The second quote is more rounded and perhaps picks up on some of the design issues, and as I say, that's from the Secretary of State. Again, I'll read it briefly. We're cutting red tape but not standards. This government doesn't want to just build houses. We want a society that has re-established powerful links between identity and place, between our unmatchable architectural heritage and future, between community and purpose. Our reformed system places a higher regard on quality, design and local vernacular than ever before, and draws inspiration from the idea of design codes and pattern books that built Bath, Belgravia and Bourneville. Our guiding principle will be, as Clough Williams Ellis said, to cherish the past, adorn the present and build for the future. Now, interesting, obviously quality and design comes out of that. No real mention of climate change, very much looking back into the past construction and what buildings look like, rather than how they function, and the building fabric element, which I think most of us would say there needs to be more work in terms of delivering climate change on. It does recognise, though, the need for quality and good design, but as I say, doesn't feel like there's much of a mention of zero carbon as being a key driver, and I'll come on to talk about that in a bit more detail in a moment. So, sorry, next slide, Layla. Thank you. So, why are they reforming the planning system? Well, a number of reasons are highlighted within the document. Not, I hasten to add, that it's not delivering climate change objectives, but the issues it raises, as previous reforms or suggested reforms have done, is about speed and delivery and blocking development. So if I run through the slides, so the first bullet point, it's too complex, so they see the planning system as too complex. It creates uncertainty and delay for developers. It's discretionary and based on case-by-case assessment, so there is a risk to developers because they can go through the process and then the fine good people on the planning committee might not like it and therefore refuse it. So they see that as a risk to the developer, and unlike some European planning models which are rule-based, a tick box exercise if you like, you need to tick all the boxes to get planning consent, they see the UK system as too subjective and too discretionary. So again, one of the key criticisms, and a criticism that we've heard for many, many years in terms of our system. Interestingly, as the document the document does set out some detail in terms of being very rule-based and standard-based, a suggestion that at some point it could be machine readable, so planning consent as machine readable, because a planning application would meet all the rules and standards that a computer could pick up and therefore issue a planning consent. So no more planning officers, which may go down very well, not necessarily with my team, but it might go down with the wider community. It also takes too long to produce local plans. 7 years is the average. I have to say we're pretty good at Sedgemoor. We usually deliver them within 3 or 4 years, 5 possibly. And of course, some of the criticism we're hearing about our own local plan is it's out of date as soon as adopted, and that's some of the issues that get picked up at our development committee because it's February 2019, because it's perceived as not embedding climate change as much as it perhaps should. There's a suggestion that it must be out of date, but of course, as I said at the start, the national planning policy hasn't changed in that time, and that's what we're guided by. There's a hierarchy of plans within the UK planning system. They talk about the complexities within the system, and there are some technical elements of how we produce our evidence, so the assessment of housing need, viability of development, and environmental impact. They see that as very complex and opaque, so they want that streamlined, so it's about streamlining and simplifying. They also see the planning system as having a very limited amount of local trust, and suggesting that just 7% trust trust communities to make decisions, trust planning authorities to make decisions on major applications for the good of the area, which is again fairly damning as an indictment. And the bottom line is it does not deliver enough homes, and that's the reason why we have the undersupply. It's an interesting, from a being a planning profession, it's a very interesting take on it, because the housing white paper that came out a couple of years ago was very much about a shared responsibility on the development industry as well for not producing homes. It does feel with the planning white paper, the attention is switched back on the planning system. And of course, as many of us will know, we can grant as many planning consents for housing as we can, but it does need people to develop and build them. So in terms of the drivers for why the reform is needed, this is very much about, well, my reading of the white paper is about delay, uncertainty and non-delivery, not necessarily flagging design issues or not delivering on those climate change objectives. So moving on to the next slide for me. So what are some of the proposals? In terms of plan making, perhaps this is one of the more fundamental changes that are being proposed. So it's saying that local plans will be much more simpler. Instead of lots of allocations and lots of different colours. If you've seen our proposals map, you'll know there's lots of different designations and constraints. Basically simplifying local plans, so you identify zones for development. So you would have a zone that would be growth. That would be suitable for substantial development. And on the basis of it being identified in the local plan, it would effectively have outline planning consent. There would be no need for any subsequent outline planning consent or planning application to come forward at that time. It would be granted planning consent in principle. Quite a key change on that. And if you think about that, you know, that's very much about speed, creating that certainty that the development industry are asking for. The second zone would be renewal, where some parts of the area would be suitable for some development. And then the third zone would be protected and where development is restricted. Now, what it doesn't do is unpick how you might go about deciding what zone you fall in, and we had a bit of a discussion at preview in terms of Sedgemoor. We're pro-growth, pro-business, and we're pro-development, and that's our ethos. We have a strong economic development strategy, a strong local plan that's supportive of development. But how does climate change embed into these zones? We are an area at high flood risk. Does that mean that we shouldn't be an area of growth? You know, it's those sort of key decision makings on where you put development that the white paper doesn't really start to unpack. In terms of local plans, it's suggesting you need to be based on clear rules. So this is going back to a system that is based on rules and standards. And they're suggesting rather than every individual local planning authority come up with their own set of planning policies, there would be some key core development management policies which would effectively be standards. And that would mean that local plans would focus more on specific issues like design codes and etc. to guide specific development. So there would be a national standard of policies. Now, of course, by introducing national standards, sometimes you lose innovation. You lose, you will default to one particular area which might not be as thought-provoking or innovative or clear thinking as other areas. So there is some dangers in that. And what we're hearing in terms of some of Steve's presentation is it's about how individual communities influence and can form and influence planning policy, and how development is delivered locally is going to be quite an important area. So if you're effectively nationalising planning policy, it does run a risk that you might lose some of that innovation. It's suggesting that local engagement will happen and be strengthened at the plan making stage, but at the planning application stage it will be streamlined. So it's suggesting again that the broad principles, there will be involvement, more involvement, but less at the detailed, at the dealing with the application stage. So again, perhaps some concerns there that we would be raising, because actually again at the detailed stage is where you're unpacking some of the climate change, the build fabric, the design quality, and those issues. The next point is quite a technical point, which is that instead of the test of soundness and the duty to cooperate, local plans will be judged on a sustainable development test. Now, in planning terms, sustainable development, that means putting development in areas where you have the most services and facilities, as we know. Again, how does that equate to climate change? That flood risk issue, for instance, it doesn't unpack that. Local plans are intended to be shorter in length, and we would only be given 30 months to prepare a local plan, and if we didn't produce one within that time, there would be sanctions as well. So again, it feels like the influence is all about streamlining and speeding up the system, rather than actually, looking at how it can change in terms of some of the climate change aspects. Next slide, please, Leila. But in terms of proposals on design and sustainability, it does pick up about planning being central to national challenges such as combating climate change. It doesn't feel like the reforms make it a key priority that would enable the planning system to respond to climate crisis, though. It's very much one point in the document. It does talk about street trees, another aspect, and it does talk about embedding a future home standard, which was out on consultation last year, but which would be delivered through the building regulations. And that's what I was saying, that actually it's those sort of standards where they're mandatory and part of building regulations is where you might see the greater difference. But there isn't, the white paper doesn't really unpack reductions in carbon and how that will be delivered within the system. It doesn't really talk about how it would, how it's seeking to meet the 2050 target, and of course we've got the 2030 target for zero carbon homes in Somerset. So it does feel like it doesn't unpack that level of detail that you would expect as part of a section on design and sustainability, though of course it does flag it up, as the first bullet indicates. It identifies more about what development needs to look like. It says that development has to be beautiful. It's based on net gain, so net benefit, rather than no net harm. And I think that's where some of the frustration that we see at planning committee is that schemes are just good enough to approve, or not bad enough to refuse, rather than good enough to approve. And I think that's an area which we'll have to wait and see how that gets unpacked through these design codes, etc. They're also suggesting where you do get beautiful design, there would be fast-track options for planning applications to go through the system quicker. They're also looking to introduce a quicker process for environmental assessment. So some of the worry is that actually in streamlining and making environmental assessment quicker, you're actually losing some of the nuances that you have currently within the system that might help you deliver some of those climate change objectives. And the key message is really that you need to expect design guidance and codes. And the diagram on the right-hand side, it comes from the National Design Guidance, which was published last year. It does talk about climate change. There, as I say, I think a lot of that will come forward through revised guidance after the white paper, but also through the future home standards in terms of looking at building fabric, etc. And as a sort of final point on design, they're expecting every local planning authority to have a chief officer for design and placemaking, not climate change, design and placemaking. So it does feel very much like climate change, whether it's wrapped up as part of design and placemaking, it does feel that it's not as explicit as perhaps it should be. Next slide, please, Layla. This is my last slide. And just a further slide to finish on and how it's dealing with infrastructure. So at the moment, we operate a system of Section 106 and Community Infrastructure Levy, which brings in revenue and obligations to allow us to deliver infrastructure, some local where that's required to support development, and some obviously that can go into a pot for larger infrastructure projects. The suggestion is that Section 106 and SIL will be removed entirely, and instead there will be a single tariff that will be collected. And then obviously that leaves some of the issues about how does infrastructure match the development and how do you do that. So effectively some issues there. I think the point of this slide really again is in terms of land supply and availability is to say that nothing's really changed in terms of the government tone on delivering housings, and the first bullet under land supply is quite important. There will be new nationally determined binding housing requirements to be secured through local plans. So we're not moving away from targets in terms of delivering housing. The second point talks about master plans and design codes need to make provision for a range of developer types. So they're talking about small builders, volume house builders. They're not talking about a range of actual development types, house types and low carbon houses. There's nothing in there about that at the moment. And the final point again is a very techie issue, which is something to do with why supply is often choked off, is because there will be lots of options on land and land banking going on, and they're suggesting they need to make that more transparent. So that's just a canter through the key areas of reform that is being suggested on the white paper. As I say, linking it to the climate change debate is quite difficult because the detail isn't there. But there, what the tone I think is really important, and I'm happy to take any questions on it. But to me, the tone is still very much about delivering housing and jobs, and climate change will be, is a nice to have. There's certainly no stepping stones, and I think one of the speakers earlier said about small stepping stones to the outcome. It doesn't feel like there's any stepping stones in the white paper, but it's going to help us greatly at this moment.
Okay, thank you, Stuart. That's quite sobering, actually. I just look at questions. Councillor Godwin Pearson.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, Stuart, for your in-depth presentation. I mean, I do find it a little bit short-sighted that there isn't more provision in there for planners to create ecological homes. And thanks to your work and Duncan's and Jill's and others in this room, Sedgemoor is leading the way with environmentally friendly, sustainable homes. And I'd really like to see some more of that, especially in the bigger developments where there's more at stake for the developers, and we can therefore, slip more conditions in there for them to create homes that are more environmentally friendly. And you and I have spoken before about things like putting in the infrastructure for ground source heat pumps or air source heat pumps into new builds, so that they might not be taken up right now, but it's a lot cheaper and quicker and environmentally friendly to install those devices when the owners decide to, But I think it's important also to separate out the carbon footprint and the environmental impact of building with the ecological impact of building. And this is another thing that we've talked about, particularly with that development on Hullgate Way, and creating the habitats for the animals that we displace. And I had a really interesting, very long conversation with a friend of mine yesterday who works with Surrey County Council's ecologists on making sure that where new housing goes in, of course, you have to bag up and then take down trees and hedgerows in order to do it. But she was saying that one of the most important things that planners can do is make sure that with the long lead times with any planning development, as soon as that planning permission has been given, we're putting in those hedgerows and those trees so that those are mature enough to provide accommodation for the bats and the dormice and others that are displaced when the building starts. And I see in Hullgate Way, actually, the ecologist did suggest that. I wonder if that's actually coming back, because it's all very well and good to say, we're going to put in back boxes and we're going to put in hedgehog homes and new hedgerows and things like that. But there's no point doing that after the development has been started, because they can't move on. The big animals can move on, but the smaller ones just die.
Exactly. There are those measures that we can do through landscape ecological management plans and things like that to try and bring those in and, like say, condition things to come in earlier. I suppose some of the issues is that until a developer gets on site and starts developing, they don't want to spend any money on the site. So that's some of the problems, and there isn't a huge amount of influence for us to require to do that, unless, of course, there is a specific ecological issue to do that. I suppose a lot of the issues, like I say, I don't want to be too down on the white paper, because the environment bill and things like that, when it does finally come forward, will have a lot of information which will influence and guide planning decisions, and will presumably be embedded into planning policy at a future date. And I think the future home standard as well, in terms of low carbon homes, is going to be quite important. I think there is an expectation that from 2025 they will be 75 to 80% lower CO2 emissions compared to current levels. So again, it's how that's embedded, because if you leave it to planning and that discretionary based system, it's less likely to happen than it is if you make it mandatory through building control. And I think that's where we want to get to, or where we should be getting to, is mandatory control on all development, rather than, as you say, the great schemes where we've worked really hard to bring forward. It should be every developer having to bring forward. And we sort of been at this place before with the Code for Sustainable Homes, and it proved to be unviable. Schemes were unviable because of the requirements that the code required. So I guess you need to make it mandatory and universal to deal with that viability issue, because then the land cost is equalised across the piece.
Thank you for that. I think at some stage it'd be really interesting to have some training on building control. I think certainly I don't understand all the intricacies, and I think that would be helpful. Councillor Bradford, you indicated you'd like to speak. Thank you very much,
Madam Chairman. Thank you very much. Thank you for that, Stuart, again. I don't know which is worse, sometimes been a planning officer or been sat on a development committee. All I'm going to say is North Newton got a housing project going forward at present, a low carbon one, and I hope that's some sort of a future to what a lot of the villages you should have, which is very important. Surely it's better in the villages to keep doing things like this rather than these big housing estates, where very often don't always comply with what we needed. Now, everybody's on about climate change. How many people do we see out digging their gardens anymore? How many people? All we do is see people digging away their grass and their soil and whatever, and putting in chipping or concrete or putting their car in. It's a totally different scenario. And if people are serious about these sort of things, they're really going to have to become very, very serious about changing the whole concept of the way we live. What's the biggest things on people's minds at the moment? Where they're going to go on holiday. Holiday. It's all we've been talking about for 6 months, where people are going to go on holiday, and they don't go once, twice, or 3 times. It's half a dozen times. Some people, but good luck to them. They want to go on holiday. That's all right. But we've got to be serious about all these things sometimes. And regarding some of the developments, the bigger ones are obviously, they had to be done for economic reasons. And bear one thing in mind, that people own the land and they haven't got to sell it. There's always been a demand for houses, and there always will be. And the economics got to stack up, and people tend to forget that sometimes. Reading that white paper down to, for what I can see of it, nothing very much has changed, to be honest. And like I said, Stuart's very often in a very unenviable position, stuck in the middle of it all. And us sat on the planning committee, we don't know where to go some ways on some of these developments, but for economic reasons and moving forward and the housing shortage, our hands go up the grant, some of these things. And look at the number of houses wanted at present in Sedgemoor, Taunton Dean, West Somerset, Mendip, and South Somerset as well. I've got all the figures in front of me here, actually, and I was quite surprised what demand there is for a lot of this housing. And really, we have to treat a lot with a lot of common sense. But one for North Newton here, we have got a low carbon scheme almost to finishing, hopefully. So we'll invite you all out. We got it. And thank you for that again, Stuart.
Thank you,
Madam Chairman.
I think those projects are really important as well, aren't they? And the neighbourhood plans and the work that the local communities do in terms of influencing that and bringing those schemes forward are going to be really important, because you need to influence the consumers, don't we? Because it's the people who are buying the houses need to be influenced as to what they want in terms of choice. Because, you know, the maximum house builders will say, well, their product sells. And without, as I say, without any mandatory requirement to change that product, it's always going to be more viable than delivering an eco house. As I say, eco houses as a norm, as a requirement through mandatory regulation, will neutralise land value, won't it? Land value will then become fairly flat, and everyone will know what they expect to get from it. So it is an economic debate. It's an economic calculation in many ways in terms of viability. And climate change or delivering low carbon will have an impact on the economics of land values, and that's always been one of the blockers. And the one thing that this white paper doesn't really address, and to be honest, the planning system hasn't addressed since 1948. So, it's not the current government, it's every government since 1948 hasn't dealt with that land value aspect of it.
Thank you for that. In terms of Councillor Bradford's comments, I don't disagree with anything he says about it not being on people's climate emergency, not being on in people's minds, and that's the whole purpose of this meeting, to be honest, to start so that we can start to be better informed, and as so-called community leaders, so that it starts to filter through in the decisions that we make and the decisions that the council makes and the reasons for that. But thank you, Stuart, because I thought it was important to bring you in at this meeting, so that for those that aren't on planning especially can hear about what is coming and the challenges that face. And I think the absolute remiss of climate emergency not to be of the highest priority for the white paper. But can you just remind me of the consultation period, please, for anybody who hasn't responded who may wish to do so?
Yeah, so it runs until the 29th of October. We'll be making a response from a Sedgemoor perspective, but also we'll be doing it from a joined-up Somerset perspective, and that's a Somerset planning officer perspective, not a Somerset County perspective.
Okay, and towns and parishes will no doubt wish to respond as well. So thank you, Stuart. Thank you for your presentation. We'll now need to move on to the what was really the subject of the meeting, and that is the strategy. So Teresa, if you're still there, and Anna, would you like to take us through where we've got to with the strategy?
Sure. Okay, so I'm just going to share my screen to go through this presentation. Can everyone see my screen?
I'm sure we will in a moment. We can't yet.
Oh, does it say loading, or does it look like it might?
Yes, I think we've got it. Yeah, we're there. Thank you.
Fab. Okay, I'm just going to go ahead and get on with it. I'm going to try and keep it short because I'm aware that we have less than an hour left, and I think we want to have a lot of discussion, and the whole point in this really is to get feedback from you, so I don't want to speak for too long. So this is just going to be a quick run through of where we're at with our Sedgemoor District Council Climate Emergency Strategy, Action Plan and supporting evidence. So to start off, so the documents that I've sent out are just drafts, so they are very much, there's more editing to be done. And also they haven't been formatted yet, so they're just sort of the text, and hopefully the format is kind of understandable. But we haven't got to a stage where we know exactly what it's going to look like and done all the nice graphics and that sort of in process. So Rachel Annals has done this nice sort of a mock-up of what the front cover will look like to give us an idea, which I also sent out to everybody. But what I've sent out to everyone isn't the final format. And it will be we're hoping to have it similar to the well-being strategy, if anyone's read that. But I won't go into that actually now. I don't think we have time for that. Okay, so a bit of background about the climate emergency. So Sedgemoor District Council did declare at full council on the 12th of March 2019, we declared a climate emergency. This is what that motion on notice looked like. So the main thing that I think to pick out of it is that we've pledged to work with partners and individuals and community groups to identify ways to make Sedgemoor and Somerset carbon neutral by 2030, taking into account both production and consumption emissions. So that's the production and consumption is what we were talking about earlier with emissions, also counting emissions that might not actually be created and being emitted within Sedgemoor. Things like we were talking about animal feed, which is produced elsewhere but then imported in. So that's kind of what we've done. We have created this action plan to identify ways to make Sedgemoor carbon neutral by 2030. So I'll talk through the climate emergency action plan and such in a moment. And a bit more, we've been working with some climate change task and finish groups, which are made up of officers and members. We did a lot of work January, February and March, looking at our own, sort of getting our own house in order and our own sort of activities as a council. And that was things like, how do we recycle at Bridgewater House? How do staff travel to work? So that's officers, and also business travel, business mileage. So that's very much our own internal emissions, which was really successful, and we came up with a lot of recommendations, and we were about to make all these changes to Bridgewater House in the way that we all function. And then COVID hit in March anyway, which helped us a lot with the working from home and the reducing our emissions from travel, but also means that a lot of the other work on that is kind of pending. But that's something that's also underway. And then alongside that, we have the Somerset-wide, I have actually written this wrong. It's not the Somerset Climate Emergency Strategy, as Teresa will point out. It's the 5 Somerset councils working together to create a Somerset-wide climate emergency strategy. And that should be published by the end of this year, and Kathy's spoken a little bit about that. So there's a bit of background to what's going on, and now I'll get stuck into our own plan. Although I do have a little graph that I think might be a little bit helpful before I get stuck in. So this graph I actually stole from a conference last week, the LDC Climate Change Conference. It's essentially to understand what the importance is of the 2030 target, because we've declared the climate emergency and that we want to become carbon neutral by 2030. So I'm going to try and explain this graph in a way that will hopefully make sense. So the government, central government, are aiming for carbon neutrality by 2050 at the moment. So that's kind of similar to what this orange dotted line looks like here. And what this graph does is it's a helpful way to understand total emissions before that point. If you think about the space taken up by the triangle, I don't know if you can actually see my cursor moving, but the triangle underneath this line would be the total emissions that we have produced before that date. So if we go with the government date, then this is the amount of emissions that we'll produce in total, and that triangle is quite big. And then if we look at the red line, that's the 2030 target. So if we can start reducing emissions now and sort of keep a steady pace, and then by 2030 we get to 0 emissions, which would be amazing. But then actually, if you look at this blue line, although the target isn't, the 0 point isn't 2030, that's if you start reducing emissions really significantly already. So rather than following the red line, which is not in such a rush, we look at the blue line, that's getting started now, and sort of reducing emissions tomorrow. And then actually in total, even though the final point is further away, that actually has a higher reduction in emissions, which will really help us sort of reach our limit of what am I talking about? The temperature limit of 1.5 degrees, where if the Earth's temperature rises by more than 1.5 degrees, then that's sort of runaway climate change, that's irreversible. So this blue line is kind of what we're looking for. And that's why it's really important. Earlier, Councillor Keane was talking about the first steps. It's baby steps, but we really do need to just get on and start doing it, basically, is what this graph is showing us. So let's get stuck in. So there are 3 documents. There's the strategy, the action plan, and the supporting evidence. Now, the strategy is just a high-level document which explains why we've declared a climate emergency. I think it's almost one of the most important documents, because if you're not on board already, then this is where you need to start. This explains where central government is at, where we've come from, why we need to act now, what happens if we don't act now. We had a discussion earlier in the pre-meeting about whether it needs to maybe be a bit more scary, actually, because at the moment we've been a bit soft, sort of vaguely mentioned the flooding, but in Steve's presentation earlier, that sort of sobering perspective might be a bit more helpful, but that's up for discussion. So that is the strategy. Also, what we haven't got in there yet is a quote from potentially a leader, a member. So I think that would sort of give it a bit more emotion potentially, because it's just a lot of information, a lot of science. But it's not the final draft. We're still open to making edits. And the next bit is the action plan. So this is the kind of, for me, I find this the really interesting bit, because this is what are we actually going to do about it. And we've got goals which we've tried to keep as sort of SMART goals, which is that they're specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. You'll notice that a lot of them still don't have the time element to them. We haven't quite figured out when we want to achieve them and what exactly is involved. So I'm still waiting for a lot of officer feedback, because I'm still finding my way around how all this works as well. So I'm waiting on a lot of feedback to sort of flesh out a lot of them. And what we've set out is we've got I'll actually just show you. So we started off with our overarching goals. So for example, here we've got that we want to promote active travel, which is walking and cycling. And then this sort of column here is about the individual steps that we'll need to take in order to promote active travel. It's a bit more detail. And then our influence, so whether that is internal, so that's actions that we're doing as a council, that's things like looking at our own fleet, looking at our own recycling in Bridgewater House, how people are travelling, which is a lot of the stuff that we've done in the Task and Finish groups earlier this year. So that's internal. Whether it's direct action, which is about changing policy, things that we can do as a district council, things that we can influence directly. And then there is a lot that is indirect action. So that is lobbying central government, working alongside Somerset County Council. So we've got here like lobbying and influencing County Council about highways, because Sedgemoor District Council doesn't really have too much, isn't too involved in highways and that sort of thing, but that's where we'd make our voice heard. We've also, so they are time specific, so we've put when will they be achieved, and also who will oversee this. And something that I think is really, really important, we've put in the co-benefits of each of these actions, and it's really, really easy to find these, and pretty much every single action in this action plan has direct co-benefits. So that's bringing people along with us. So even if, it's not that we don't want people to not agree with the science, but it's sort of ultimately, it's the slide that Steve showed at the very end, that was the cartoon that I've seen many times of somebody saying, oh, but what if it's all a hoax? What if climate change isn't really happening? And there's all these brilliant things happening. So people becoming healthier, people's mental health improving, communities, community cohesion, economic benefits, all of that sort of stuff, which just, is sort of creating a better world as well. And I'll just talk you through the sections a little bit. So we've put 6 sections into our action plan to sort of break it up into the different categories. What's of note is that what have we put? So we've put nature and adaptation next to each other in one section, because a lot of the adaptation to the natural environment changes that we'll need to make are sort of beneficial. So things like planting more trees, that's something that's bringing us to carbon neutrality. Also helps us adapt to the effects of climate change, like flooding and more trees. Trees are a really fantastic natural flood defence, for example. So those are put together, but you can see the 6 there. And then finally, our supporting evidence is, what stage am I at? Apologies. So the supporting evidence is for people that are not so engaged with the topic. We're hoping for this to be a bit more living and breathing, so as things come in, this is expected to grow. As projects come underway, this will probably get fleshed out a little bit more. And it's the bit that, as you read through the action plan, you might think, oh, hang on, but what does that really mean? Because we don't want to put loads of information in the action plan and overload people with information for readers who are just looking to find, okay, so what is Sedgemoor District Council doing about the climate emergency? This supporting evidence is the kind of the gory details for people who want to know that. So some of the key points that we wanted to talk about today, one of them is about how this aligns with the Somerset-wide climate emergency strategy, which is a shame that we can't talk about it too much, because it would be really helpful if I could just show you the Somerset-wide climate emergency strategy, but that's not, we're not meant to release that yet. But then there are some parts of our strategy on our action plan where it might seem like there are gaps, but that's largely because it's running alongside the Somerset-wide strategy. So, for example, things like highways and cycle routes and pedestrianisation, that's actually covered a lot by Somerset-wide climate emergency strategy. But then there are also some more local elements, particularly a lot of community engagement, where our Sedgemoor District Council climate emergency action plan actually covers that Somerset-wide strategy is missing. So they sort of fill in the gaps for each other. Something else to note is that there are 9 work streams in the Somerset-wide strategy, whereas we only have 6 sections, and that's because there are some bits that we don't necessarily need to cover. Things like communication, we've got sort of runs actually throughout all of our sections. We've put together energy and built environment, because whilst we were helping to write the Somerset-wide strategy, it became quite clear that there was a lot of overlap between energy and built environment, and sort of putting in energy efficiency measures actually relates to both energy and the built environment. Oh, and there are also other strategies that sort of run alongside it as well. For example, we've helped to produce, we've commissioned with the other 4 councils, the WSP Somerset electric vehicle charging strategy, which will form part of the Somerset-wide strategy, and also we've referred to it in ours, and we'll sort of say we will comply with what this strategy says when it comes out. That's due to be published in October. There's also a Somerset pollinator strategy, which we've referred to, and also the active travel cell, which Andrew Redding from Sedgemoor District Council sits on, and they're sort of meeting regularly, and that's a county-wide group as well. Okay, that's enough on that. So also, this is something that we would like to discuss a lot more, and probably would be really good to discuss in this session. How do we measure and evaluate the actions proposed versus the reduction in carbon emissions that are required? So we haven't actually laid out in that much detail how we do intend to measure our success. We want it to be very involved with the community and be constantly receiving feedback. For sort of a baseline, we have commissioned the Centre for Sustainable Energy to do a report on Bridgewater House baseline emissions. They're doing an energy report for us. And there is also potential to do a district-wide report as well. We've put in the budget, we've sort of set aside some funding for that if that's needed. But I think it would be really helpful for us to have a discussion today about how we do intend to measure, because that's part of the smart action. It needs to be measurable, and we need to make sure that we are achieving this so that that line definitely does curve down. So finally, what I want from everyone today is feedback on the format, although it's not the final format. Is it accessible? Does it make sense? Do we have too much detail or too little detail? Does it sort of tell a story? Does it get you interested, give a bit of background, take you along with it, and make you feel motivated to sort of to change your behaviour or to get on board with it? And yeah, do we sort of, does it seem justified as well? And additionally, how much further consultation do we think that we need as well? So we had the conversation with Steve about Somerset Climate Action Network potentially running consultation for us with parishes and local community groups. So that is something that we're intending to do. But it'd be good to have a discussion about that as well. So that's a brief run through of the strategy, action plan and supporting evidence, and I'm happy to take any questions if needed.
Thank you, Anna. That's really useful. Members will have had in their agenda packs the draft strategy and the action plan, and certainly there's lots of information in there. So before I sort of relay my thoughts, does anybody else would like to ask any questions or make any points? Councillor Harvey.
Thank you, Chairman. I've already shared with you some thoughts, which I will email on to Anna. I think it's a very good strategy and one that does fulfil most of the requirements we want. I have got some... I just wonder about the amount of detail and whether we want more detail or less detail. I mean, I have made some suggestions of things that could be included, and I wonder whether this is the right forum for us to say what those are, or else simply to email them to Anna and what Anna actually thinks about members' suggestions for inclusion.
Okay, yeah, that's a good point actually, because we could be here for quite a long time if we're all, because I'm sure if all of us read through it, there's quite a lot more that could be put in there and a lot of discussion around that. We only have 35 minutes left, so I don't know, Kathy, what do you think about timing? What's the best process here?
I think that if members can give just like headlines, there's the different sections, and I think it'd be really just useful to pick up if members have got any comments on the different sections through the action plan, because then that will give us sort of a feel about how members are feeling about it and whether there are any omissions or anything. But we'll leave the finer detail, I think, because all of these issues are going to be picked up in an ongoing way through the task and finish group, I guess, because I think the interesting thing for me is looking at this now. When we started off, there really very little had been done within Sedgemoor, had it? And the things that have been achieved in-house have happened quite quickly, partly because of COVID has forced things upon us, but it has shown how things can move along. But it sort of feels like it's a wider agenda now. And it's good that so many elements are in this action plan. So I don't think we need to go through them all obviously in detail, else we'd be here till midnight, but knowing that they are here and for development is a good thing. But Councillor Harvey, if you'd just like to give us sort of the headlines of the sections that you would like to make comments, and then I would suggest for yourself and any other members, if they can just give a sort of headlines on the sections and then email in the more specifics.
Okay, I want to make one general point first, which is that the plan, I don't think, goes into sufficient detail about how we work with parishes and town councils. It's something that the Stronger Somerset bid has been making a great deal about, and I think it would be useful to be having some thoughts about how parishes can be advised on how to put their own climate emergency plans together. What are the sorts of things we should do? We had a couple of very interesting slides from Steve, I think it was slides 37 and 38, which I think would be a useful starting point. But I don't know whether it's possible to produce a sort of template, or whether its officers would work with parishes. Certainly, if you want a pilot, I can offer Burnham and Highbridge as a pilot for us to look at. But I think if we're going to be successful, we have to get down to the parish and town council level. The points I was going to make in more detail, which I won't go through, I was going to make some points about cycling, about bus services, where we talk about inter-town transport, but we don't really talk much about rural transport. I think that is a bit of an omission. And I wanted to talk about possibilities of solar panels in car parks as a way of showing our investment in good energy sources. And our last investment was in a filling station in Bristol, which I think caused some people's eyebrows to raise. And I think there are possibilities there where we could generate income at the same time as doing something that is good for the environment. But I will email those to Anna. Thank you.
Thanks. Actually, I did receive that feedback. Kathy did pass that on earlier, so I sort of made a note that most of it is just really good points, and we will go away and look into that, because I think all of those would be totally valid to include. So I think I'll go away and do a bit of research and see whether we can include things like that.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you.
I think actually, though, there is something in the action plan about solar-powered ticket machines that's already happening. So that's really, really good. I think the things that stood out for me was in the strategy itself, the overarching strategy. I would really like to see inclusion of a local impact, as Steve has taken us through this morning, inclusion of that, because it makes it real for us, I think, and therefore likely to have more effect and more impetus. The other particular aspect I'm particularly interested in is around air quality. And on the first page of travel, it says there's been a noticeable reduced symptoms of those with respiratory conditions during lockdown resulting from less traffic. So I think that would be worthy of a little more work, especially, well, Bridgewater in particular, but some of our towns are sort of traffic bottlenecks, and looking at that along with hospital admissions. Yeah, so that. I think those are the two ones for now. But it's just heartening to know these are in the action plan. And the question I have, I guess, will this action plan, will this be taken forward through the Leaders Task and Finish group? And I'm just wondering if there's potential for further member involvement in working parties on specific items within this plan, because I think the more members we get involved and engaged with this process, the benefits will be, will there be more benefits in the long term? I've just seen, just remember to look at the chat box. Teresa, okay. Yes, you may come in.
Yeah, thank you very much, Kathy. I'd like to first congratulate Anna on all the work that she's done here. I think she's done remarkably well, considering she's done this mainly through COVID, with a little bit of support and steerage from me when I've got time, but most of this work is done from Anna just getting down to it and hard graft, because it is like trying to herd cats, as they say. I suppose from my point of view, I would just like to check in with members that we have got it into a point where it's accessible, it's easy to read, and you can sit down and read it over a cup of coffee and get the gist of where we're going, rather than be faced with a great tome of words that, you lose interest in halfway through. So I suppose that's, for me, that's really important. I totally pick up about Councillor Harvey's point about the parish councils. And that again picks up Anna's point about further consultation, about how we need to get out and take this document out to the wider community and stakeholders. Now, I do agree with you, Kathy, that we need to do some work about actually how we're going to take this forward and monitor it, and who's going to be sort of responsible for the different work streams going through the organisation. We have to have a buy-in from everybody into this, because we can't expect Anna or a few officers or just a few members to carry this. We've all got to buy into this, and there is an action there about the culture change, which I think we've talked about earlier, about members and officers in particular. It needs to be our first thoughts every time we start to look at either new policies or new projects, or whatever we're doing. We've got to sort of look at the climate change aspects, impacts of that to start off with. We have put and again, I'd be interested in members' views. I think what we put together here, or Anna has, is actually put together a realistic document within the resources that we have. It does stretch us quite a bit, but it is realistic. And I think you've already made that point in things that we've already started to achieve. So I've just realised I've had
That's
on my head, so typical. So I think, so what I was going to say is that we've put in a £200,000 growth bid into the MTFP this time round. Now, whether that won't cover everything we want to do, but we think it is a realistic one. But again, I'd like to get members' views on whether, we should be pushing for something more, or within our, what we've got and what we're doing. I can see some further work that we need to do, perhaps working with Somerset West and Learning in particular, but other district councils, and using one another's resources. And that's another thing that Anna has done. I don't want to make Anna sound like she's on a pedestal too much, but she's actually started up a network with the other district officers that are doing something like that. So she is having those conversations around. I could go on forever, but I guess what I really want to do is get a feel that we're going in the right direction with this document. We are being ambitious enough without being going to hold ourselves up to hoist ourselves by our own petard by promising stuff that we just ain't going to be able to get round to doing, so that we can actually deliver for the communities out there. And I think there's a bit more work to do in supporting evidence with the Somerset-wide strategy to actually link into all that information. So where feels like there's gaps in any of that, they aren't really, as Anna was saying, we can actually signpost into the different links into the Somerset-wide strategy as well. So I think that's probably as much as I just wanted to put into the meeting, and again, open to any questions or thoughts from members at this point.
I don't seem to have any more questions. I'm slightly concerned that some members may not have seen the strategy and action plan. I certainly received mine with my agenda, so I was assuming everybody else had. So I think what we need to do is to make sure that is set. I mean, that was the focal point for this afternoon, really. But what we can do is we'll make sure that the draft strategy and action plan is sent around with inviting comments in for anything that may be missed. But I too would like, sorry Anna, if I didn't do this already, to thank you for all your hard work, because coming from nothing, this is all new territory. And to think that you've produced this from nothing, basically, in a fairly short space of time, is very impressive. And I think the action plan in particular will guide us in the future. It's for us as members and officers to make that work, isn't it? So
would it be useful then if Anna and I sent out the draft document if people haven't seen it? I really apologise for the members that haven't had sight of it before, because we had made the assumption that everyone had got it and read it beforehand.
Me
so
too.
I do apologise about that. Perhaps if we could do that and ask some just with a list of questions that we'd like answers, so that people can sort of structure their thoughts and comments back to us.
Yeah, and I think if we can sit down and look at the different areas and then maybe identify working group areas for members for get involved in working groups, task and finish, little task and finish groups to feed in, that might be useful as well. Certainly with Councillor Harvey's comments about particular areas of his interest. I have to say I'm really pleased to see as well in here about undertaking a review of all the policies to ensure that climate emergency is reflected in all the activities, and investigating possible divestment from fossil fuel stocks and companies. I heard the other day that even BP are divesting from fossil fuel investment. So that hopefully will lead the way for us. I'll look in the chat box. Councillor Gibson.
Oh, yeah, I think that I probably need to go over and then ask my questions. The booklets. I just wanted one question for Anna, really, about the energy production you brought up. I just wondered if there was any aspects that we will be looking at energy production in Sedgemoor that was sustainable, and you said about measuring that impact about energy is to look at really maybe who's buying from green energy providers, clean energy providers. I don't know. I'm sure you've thought of that and put it in. So I'll look through the document and then maybe send you some questions. Thank you, Anna.
Okay, yeah, that's really helpful to identify, actually, because in the energy section there are a few notes about how we'll support local community energy, renewable energy community groups, as well as helping people to switch as well to renewable energy tariffs, that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Bradford. Are you there, Councillor Bradford?
Sorry, Madam Chairman.
That's all right. It's a relief to know you're there. I thought everybody had frozen for a moment.
Well, we did freeze. You know, thank you, Anna, for that report. But a lot of these things are going to start in the schools at a young age. If you're going to have a lot of change, anything, it's a bit like cutting a hedge. You started off young, you're going to get a good hedge. When you get halfway up and start messing about, it never looks the same. So all these things need to be done within the education system, to school the young people educated. You need to look at their strategies and some of their curriculums and see something they could cut out that ain't no good to them in life, and look at some of the things that they benefit a lot more from. I think this might well be it. Can you all hear me?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you.
Sorry, I have to say that. You know, that's experience. I'm 73, and that's experience of life. If you're going to learn anything, you start early in life. You start early in life, right?
Very true.
You know, and it's not very often that parish and town councils take the responsibility of teaching people all the time, because, you know, parents got to take a big say in this. I think they have. But the trouble with the modern world today, there isn't always the time to do these things. Everybody wants to be there in a hurry, and maybe they might have to change. You know, where we got to in a hurry, you might have to take your time. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Sorry to harp on, that's how I feel.
No, that's what we're here for.
You did right.
So, if there's no more comments in sort of bringing this item to a conclusion with some recommendations, what I'd like to propose, and I will need a seconder, is that we deliver climate emergency training and carbon. I've forgotten the name of the phrase. Anna, you've mentioned it to me before. Carbon literacy.
Carbon literacy, yeah.
Yes, because I don't know how many of you saw in this week's Wellbeing newsletter, there was a really good sort of carbon footprint survey, which I think would be useful for all members who didn't happen to see it, to be sort of promoted for them to see it. So I'd like to propose that we, at one of the Wednesday afternoon full council drop-ins, that we invite Steve Muse, and in conjunction with Teresa and Anna, to organise full council training on climate emergency, to investigate the declaration of an ecological emergency for Sedgemoor based on evidence, of course. It's within the action plan, but maybe just to bring it out, because it is key to success of the aims and objectives around identifying community, youth groups, parish councils to work with to raise awareness, share good practice and empower everybody to do more. And finally, to look at areas where members can get involved in working parties on specific elements of the action plan to be determined. And we'll do that through email and through sending the plan out again and asking for particular areas of interest. I hope that sounds acceptable to all members. Do I have a seconder for that somewhere?
I'm happy to second that.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay. So that brings us to the conclusion of that item. And I'd like to thank everybody involved and everybody for your contributions, because it's been quite a full-on sort of afternoon, really. So thank you. Thank you, Teresa and Anna. We will now move on to the final part of the meeting, you may be relieved to know, and that's the work programme. Rose, could you just take us through our future meetings and what we've got logged up so far? I'm just thinking as I say this that we'll need to include, I think, bring back this strategy in a few months' time, just to see how things are progressing would be good. So Rose.
Hello, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I will make a note of that to bring it back in a few months' time. To have a look at that again. Coming up on the work programme, we do have there is a session tomorrow on neighbourhood plans, which is like a workshop style session. That's at 10:30 tomorrow. I will perhaps just send out forward the Skype appointment just in case it has disappeared on anybody's Skype or Outlook since the update has happened. There will be a special committee on the 9th of November, leading on from today, looking at the Somerset-wide climate emergency strategy. And the ordinary committee is the week after, on the 16th of November. And at the moment, we were looking at the community safety and in particular community triggers, what they are and how they work, and that would involve getting in somebody from the police, because they are the partner that chairs those meetings. Looking ahead to the joint committee there, alongside the budget, we are looking at having like a COVID response item on there as well, with a focus on 3 sort of spotlight items. So one of them we'd talked about being antisocial behaviour, and then we'll look into what other items could be on there. I won't be at the committee in November because I'm going on maternity leave in October. But if there's any other sort of ideas that people have for the other committees, then if you want to sort of bring up ideas now or let me know by email after the committee, that would be welcomed.
Okay, thank you, Rose. Thank you. And I do apologise to members that we've had quite a long session this afternoon and there's another one tomorrow. But this one should have taken place a couple of weeks ago, but was postponed because of the Stronger Somerset's joint scrutiny. So that's why they've come one after the other. Yeah, so I think what can happen is if you'd like to email Rose and I potential topics for future scrutinies. Janet, I see you've put something in the chat box, and I think that will probably be picked up through the working with towns and parishes climate emergency matters.
Yes, thank you. That I think that comes under our small steps, the quick wins that we can do for ourselves.
Yes, absolutely. I'd say we need to. A start has been made, but we need to keep going at a pace. But before we finish the meeting, I'd just like to thank Rose for all your hard work over the time you've been with us, and to wish you well. Your gain is our loss for a little while, but anyway, I'm sure on behalf of the committee, sort of wish you well in the next few months. And but we've got another meeting to go before then, haven't we? So with that brings us to the end of the meeting, and I'd like to thank all members for your input. It's been quite a long meeting today, but thank you, and I now declare the meeting closed. Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.